The date is Wednesday, February 25th, 2015. At one of Monaco's most expensive penthouses, police are waiting. Their target has just touched down on a private jet, half an hour away. He's in a blue suit jacket, an open-collared shirt, and exudes the quiet luxury of the French Riviera. He was born into a world of privilege and has used that to transform himself into one of the most important people in the luxury art world. But within hours, he'll be in handcuffs. He is accused of defrauding over $1 billion using some of the most famous paintings in human history, and his arrest is about to blow the top-secret art world wide open. Welcome to Malignant Design. This is the crazy story of Yves Bouvier, how he double-crossed billionaire villains, created the biggest pile of private art anywhere on Earth, and may have gotten away with it. Yves Charles Edgar Bouvier was first brought into the art business by his father, Jean-Jacques, who owned a shipping company called Natural Le Coultre. The company gave Yves a comfortable childhood in the small town of Avully. He had a quiet country life growing up in the 60s and 70s, but by his teens, Yves couldn't wait to get to the city. That meant Geneva, where his father's business was based. He became his father's apprentice, learning the ins and outs of the shipping business, and it didn't take long for Yves to prove himself to be much more than a spoiled son. He worked hard to build connections for his father, and it was noticed. Yves had a drive that was slowly taking the business in a completely new direction. Jean-Jacques made Yves assistant manager in 1995 when he was 32, and 2 years later he officially handed over control of the company to his son. Yves had inherited the throne, and he wasted no time. He had a vision that seemed to have no limits. In one way, he trimmed down the business, choosing to only deal in art instead of the company's history of furniture, machinery, food, and war supplies. In another way, he expanded. Yves took the roots his father had planted and grew the company to towering new heights. Yves saw something his father never did, that the true value of the business wasn't in moving products. It was in the special status that the company could offer, avoiding taxes. As long as items sat in the warehouse at Geneva, they weren't subject to any tax. They were technically still considered in transit. That meant Yves didn't have to chase quantity. The big money wouldn't be from shipping tons of furniture or everyday goods. He should instead be looking for quality, single items with a big value. Bern may have been the geographical capital of Switzerland, and Zurich the business capital. But Yves Bouvier was about to make Geneva a very different kind of capital, the capital of hidden money. Yves could see that Natural Le Coultre stood at the crossroads of two industries that never went out of fashion, art and taxes. So he began marketing his Geneva warehouse as something called a freeport, and Yves was purpose-built for artwork. Underground vaults, world-class security, and even temperature-controlled rooms. Since the majority of luxury art pieces were bought as investments, this was a collector's heaven. Buyers and sellers could even meet inside the freeport to exchange pieces. They could view the art, draw up contracts, and formalize a deal. All it took to transfer ownership was the changing of a tag. And best of all, this was all tax-free. The more collectors and investors Yves convinced to store their art there, the more it grew. Natural Le Coultre was becoming an art supercenter. The facility grew in size, and despite keeping its contents under wraps, by 2012, Yves Bouvier's collection of artwork was worth an estimated $100 billion, making it by far the most valuable in the world. Yves didn't stop there. He built a new freeport in Singapore, which cost a staggering $100 million, and just a few years later, he opened another, this time in Luxembourg. Freeports were popping up everywhere. A major part of a Christopher Nolan blockbuster involved the heist of a Geneva freeport. And Damian Lewis's character in the show Billions used a freeport to keep his money away from taxes. Freeports were now mainstream, and as the king of freeports, Yves Bouvier was fabulously wealthy. But behind the scenes, one of the biggest sources of his money wasn't actually in Geneva. It wasn't in Singapore or Luxembourg either. It was coming from a single client, one he had spent years developing a close and confidential relationship with, and one that was about to be his biggest problem. It all went back to 2003, when Bouvier was still in the process of expanding his freeport empire. Then, a $6 million Marc Chagall painting arrived at Bouvier's company. It had been bought by a Swiss resident in Cologne, an area of Geneva. But this piece had a problem. It was missing the most important element, a certificate of authenticity, known in the art world as provenance. Without this, there was no way to verify if this rare painting was genuine or not. Yves could fix it. He spent the next few days chasing up his sources and eventually got his hands on the document. He was willing to give it over under one condition. Yves wanted an introduction to the mysterious buyer of this expensive piece. The representative agreed and put the two in touch. The buyer was from Russia. He was a billionaire, an oligarch tied to the Kremlin who made his fortune in finance and agriculture. He had recently moved to Europe, where he bought up the Monaco football team, an entire Greek island, and even land in Florida from Donald Trump. But he was also an incredibly dangerous figure. He had been accused of murder, targeted by powerful business elites, and survived a Russian prison. This was why he moved to Switzerland in the first place. He even wore a bulletproof vest out of fear of assassination. Getting into business with this man would be incredibly risky, but Yves Bouvier couldn't help himself. He had always been a risk taker. That's what had turned his father's business into the world's most valuable free port. To Yves, the potential reward here was enormous, and so he set up a face-to-face meeting with the elusive figure, Dmitry Rybolovlev. When Yves arrived at a mansion in Cologny, he was nervous. Dmitry Rybolovlev was a suspicious man by nature, but this was Yves' chance to get what he really wanted. He was going to offer to become the family's personal art agent. He had his sales pitch all ready. Yves knew the industry like the back of his hand. He had lived and breathed the Swiss art world since he was a child. Plus, through his Freeport company, he could arrange to ship them all as well. Basically, Yves could handle the entire service from end to end, something no one else could. Of course, Yves wasn't going to do all this for free. He had a business to run, and so he proposed to take a 2% commission fee on all of the purchases. On a $20 million piece, that would work out to $400,000. Luckily, Rybolovlev had already been impressed by how Yves Bouvier handled his $6 million Marc Chagall painting. With a handshake, the two began one of the biggest buying sprees in art history. It was the perfect match. Rybolovlev had grand plans. He loved European culture, and his dream was to build a full-size replica of a part of the Palace of Versailles. He would fill the halls with the world's most impressive artwork. This was where Yves Bouvier came in. If anyone could track down iconic pieces that weren't known to the public, it was him. With the backing of Russian oligarch money, Yves had the firepower he needed. He bought up paintings by Gustav Klimt, Amedeo Modigliani, Mark Rothko, Pablo Picasso, and dozens others to make one of the most expensive private art collections in history. One standout was Salvator Mundi, a masterpiece by Leonardo da Vinci. It was one of the most sought-after paintings in the world, and Yves had got his hands on it for Rybolovlev. But this painting was about to unravel the dark truth happening behind the scenes. A couple of months after the painting's sale, in 2014, a gossip piece was published in the New York Times. It reported that the piece had been sold for $75 million. This was a routine article out of the notoriously secretive art world. It was an unofficial number heard through the grapevine. But 3,800 miles away from the New York Times headquarters, Dmitry Rybolovlev read that column as he usually did each morning. Sitting in his mansion in Cologny, he was stunned. He had paid Bouvier $127 million for the Salvator Mundi. If what he was reading was anywhere near accurate, Yves had made around $37 million by selling it to him. And that was just a single painting. Rybolovlev had trusted Yves for 12 years, buying paintings directly through him for what he thought was the best market price. The whole time he thought Yves had only been taking a 2% commission, but now the secret was out. For Dmitry Rybolovlev, a man who was used to respect and loyalty from his business partners, this was the ultimate betrayal, and he was ready to go to war. He was determined to take down Yves Bouvier one way or another. Putting him behind bars would only be the beginning, and in the process, he would blow the lid on one of the biggest controversies in art history. Yves Bouvier was summoned to Rybolovlev's $300 million penthouse in Monaco. The sun was rising when Bouvier's private jet touched down at the Côte d'Azur airport in Nice. As far as Yves knew, nothing was wrong. He had been doing his job, scouting paintings as usual, and this was going to be a routine meeting. Yves was chauffeured the half-hour drive to Monaco, where he strolled around the harbour filled with mega yachts. But when he arrived at La Belle Époque, the historic building where Rybolovlev lived, he wasn't met with a handshake, a meal, or a new painting to look for. Instead, the police were waiting. They handcuffed Yves and drove him to the station. He was questioned the entire afternoon, thrown into a prison cell, and the next day was formally charged with fraud and money laundering. Yves was kept in custody for 3 days before being released on bail for €10 million, a price he had no problem paying. A month later, Dmitry filed lawsuits against Bouvier in Singapore, followed by lawsuits in Monaco and New York. Dmitry was chasing Yves around the world, trying to tie him up in as many legal battles as possible. The more lawyers looked into it, the more they learned just how much Yves had made. In one trade, Bouvier bought a Rothko painting for $80 million. Soon after, he flipped it to Rybolovlev for $180 million. That meant Bouvier had made $100 million, virtually overnight. Over the years, from selling paintings to this one client, Yves Bouvier had apparently pocketed a mind-blowing $1 billion. Was this the price of doing business, a finder's fee, or pure fraud? The lawsuits also included a mysterious woman named Tanya Rappo. Back when Bouvier had wanted to meet Rybolovlev, he was so desperate that he offered a commission to the person who introduced them. That person was Tanya Rappo. Tanya didn't just know Dmitry Rybolovlev. She was so close to his family that she was the godmother of their daughter, Anna. But behind their backs, the entire time, she had quietly banked millions over the years, taking a cut every time Yves sold a painting to her friend. And that wasn't all. Yves Bouvier had even been involved in that very first deal, the Marc Chagall painting, without Rybolovlev knowing. From the very beginning, Yves Bouvier had meticulously planned their relationship, acting as a friend and confidant on one hand, and, according to Rybolovlev, squeezing him for all he was worth with the other. The fight between Yves Bouvier and Dmitry Rybolovlev was spread over 3 different continents, with high-powered lawyers combing through paperwork to find evidence. It dragged on for 9 years. But here's the funny thing. Even if Rybolovlev had been duped, he still made an enormous amount of money. That Da Vinci painting, he sold it on for $450 million, making it the most expensive art sale in history. That piece has since gone missing, and according to emails released from Jeffrey Epstein, it was part of an international money laundering scheme connecting Dmitry Rybolovlev with Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince, MBS, and Donald Trump. For now, that theory is still just a theory, but with Jeffrey Epstein's death and mounting pressure on Trump's private life, Rybolovlev might prove to be the key that unlocks another conspiracy. In December 2024, both sides decided to put their weapons down and make a deal, secret from the public. The court battle is officially over. However, for Yves Bouvier, just as quickly as one enemy disappeared, a new one has emerged. The Swiss government is claiming that he owes $821 million in back taxes. Switzerland has also introduced tighter regulations for free ports, meaning there must be an assigned contact person for each piece of art. But as always, there are ways around the law. Today, Yves Bouvier is still a free man, and a very wealthy one. The Bouvier affair gave the world a rare glimpse into the feuds between the ultra-wealthy, and it proved that beyond anything else, information is the most powerful commodity. Yves Bouvier made over $1 billion with the information he had, helping him join the elite class of people who he once worked for. Now he's out of the business, having sold his Geneva, Singapore, and Luxembourg free ports. From operating a small shipping company, he created an empire and conquered the world of luxury art. And despite putting a target on his back, he managed to make it out in one piece. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We make in-depth documentaries every month that explore secrets that nobody else is talking about, and you don't want to miss our next one.